Hello and welcome to today's webinar on researching Native American ancestors at NEHGS. My name is Ginevra Morse, the Director of Education and Online Programs at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation will be Meaghan Siekman, Senior Researcher at NEHGS. Her areas of interest and expertise include colonial New England, New York, and German genealogy, immigration to America, American Indian history and lineage, African American research, westward migration and settlement, and tracing maternal lines. In the next 45 minutes or so, Meaghan will cover some basics on how to start researching your American Indian ancestors. She'll also discuss the types of records that will be most helpful in your research and provide tips for getting the most out of those records. She'll then conclude with a case study. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. Meaghan will answer as many as she can in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. There is no handout for this lecture, but you can take screen or slide captures by clicking on the camera icon on the upper right of your screen. This event is also being recorded, and the link to the video will be shared with you in the next day or so. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Meaghan.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could join me today. I just want to give you a little bit of background about myself. I think it's always important to kind of know where we all come from. I did my graduate work out in Arizona. Before that I had started in New York researching American Indians in New York. I went to school at Union College in Schenectady, New York, and there was introduced to some of my Mohawk friends. And then when I moved out to Arizona, I continued to research out there and became involved with a lot of the Native groups out in that area of the country. So I'm passionate about this topic. My focus was mainly on tribal museums. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. And I was interested in how tribal museums were reaching out to their communities and working with them to develop their exhibits. That kind of fed into genealogy at the same time because the museums were really driven and focused on the community itself and the families that were living there to develop the exhibits. So I kind of came to genealogy as a historian, so kind of a different direction, even though genealogy has kind of been a passion of mine for a long time. And so I kind of have a historian's approach to everything I do. I'm sure you'll probably see a little bit of that today. This photograph is just some of the baskets that I've collected from Akwesasne. That's right up the border between New York and Canada. And that's kind of the area where I primarily focused my my research. But today I'm going to kind of expand that. We're going to talk a bit about the groups primarily in the Northeast. So that blue oval there is kind of the groups that we're going to be talking about. So New York, New England, up into Atlantic Canada. And then you can kind of see that this is like the Eastern Woodlands is typically how these people are described by academics, and that expands further into the west and down south as well. So they're all related, and you'll kind of see that even as we talk about some of our collections here at NEHGS, how folks, especially with removal and movement over time, how people become connected to different areas of the country. But we will be focusing primarily on this region of the country and what resources we have for these groups. So getting started with Native genealogy in general, there's a few things that you're going to want to keep in mind. First, are what are your objectives? So this is typical for any research that we do. You kind of have to come to things with a research question. So there's a couple different reasons why folks typically end up researching their tribal ancestors. One is they're trying to get tribal membership into a tribe, and they have to provide documentation of that connection. Others are documenting a known Native family, so these might be people who are already members of tribes that are looking to document their family back further. And then the most common that I see, at least in my line of work here at NEHGS, are folks that have the family lore or the story that says they have an American Indian ancestor somewhere in their lineage, and they're trying to figure out if those stories are true, and if so, locating documentation of that ancestor. So knowing your objectives are really important in this. If you're looking for tribal membership, there's a few things that you're going to want to keep in mind with that as well. Membership requirements vary by nation, so you'll want to first determine what it is you'll need for proof of your enrollment. It's important to note here that each tribe will have its own requirements, so that there's not just one umbrella requirement for all of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, for example. So you can see here, this is the St. Regis Mohawk guidelines, and they follow a 25% blood quantum verified through documentation of the ancestry. Other nations, such as the Mashpee Wampanoag, require a direct line of descent, and that the individual live in or near Mashpee or have family members that do, and that they can demonstrate an active tribal community involvement. So if your objective is tribal enrollment, excuse me, you'll first want to become well acquainted with the requirements for that nation, and then also find what guidelines are available through the tribal website or by contacting the tribal clerk's office. You'll probably want to contact them as well, even if you're doing genealogical research for other purposes. Typically, tribes have information that could be helpful in your search for your Native ancestors. So DNA, this is a big question that we get here at NEHGS all the time, is why exactly should I take a DNA test, and what is it going to do for me in identifying Native ancestry? So some of the ways that a DNA test can be helpful for you, especially if you're just trying to prove family lore stories, that it can give you an idea of if you have any Native ancestry at all in your DNA. So your autosomal DNA test will give you a sense of if your Native ancestor is within the last 5 to 7 generations or thereabout. And typically these are generations that you could then be able to research and find some sort of documentation to go along with the DNA test. DNA tests also are great because they can help you get in touch with distant cousins and learn about other relatives who might be able to have more information about their families that could help you figure out your own ancestry. There are, of course, limitations to DNA tests. DNA tests can only give you a probability of the chance that you have Native ancestry in your genetics. And these tests are based upon comparing your results to other people. So there are the chances for false positives, also false negatives. False positives are more common since the haplogroups for many American Indians can also be found in other parts of the world, such as Europe and Asia. The most obvious problem I see with the DNA test is that being American Indian is more a question of culture and politics than it is about your genetics. So you're not Native American if you have it in your DNA necessarily. You have to be recognized by a tribe to be a member. So just getting the DNA test isn't going to provide you tribal membership. It's also not going to be able to tell you which tribal nation you're coming from, so these are based on broad connections. And in most cases, it's not going to be accepted for proof of tribal membership. And this is changing. I think there are a few tribes that are now allowing that to be the case, but for the most part, they're not accepting DNA as proof of membership. So these are the limitations of the test. So it can be helpful to provide you information, but it's not kind of an end-all, be-all for determining your Native ancestry. So I want to get right into talking about some of the resources we have here at NEHGS that could help you in your search. We have the books that are available in our library and also in our store that are helpful if you're getting started, particularly here in Massachusetts and New England. So the Dictionary of American Indian Place and Proper Names in New England. This is very helpful when reading deeds to identify locations, which is typically what genealogists use it for, because it lists the native name for places and then it gives you the current location. But there's also a list of American Indians by name in the back of the book that can help you, and also the locations that they're from. So if you're looking for a particular individual, or if you know a specific location where your ancestors are coming from and want to see if you can find somebody that you can connect to, this is a great resource. Indian Deeds, use it in the same way. So this is a collection of early deeds here in Plymouth County, and these have information on land transactions between English and Native groups. Deeds are really important, and we'll be talking about some probates and some deeds later on in the presentation. Typically, you then can see Native names alongside English names, or transactions between individuals can give you an idea of how folks are related, or how lands were given up, and or how removals happened. So this is an important resource to getting started. And vital records. So you're going to do your genealogy in much the same way that you would do genealogy for any other ethnic group. So here at NEHGS, you can use we have resources here for Massachusetts Vital Records, and a number of books up here on our 7th floor for your birth, marriage, death, church, and burial records. You're going to be looking in records like this for individuals who are identified as Indians, or by some other term that signifies that they're not white, although you will also find that people are labeled as a variety of different things over time. So you're going to want to keep that in mind too. But you're going to move backwards through vital records in much the same way that you would for any other family research. So again, as I just mentioned, racial or tribal descriptors may vary across records. So you're going to want to keep this in mind as you're trying to trace your ancestors back in time. So here's a few examples. So this is from the Juin collection. You have Jerome Abenakis here. So right in the name, they're identifying him as an Abenaki. And then in the next record, just another example from the same collection, they're identifying the individual as Indian. So you can see that you might have both versions of this throughout records in the same collection. And here's a few for the same family, and you can see how their racial identification changes over time. So in some of the records, individuals are identified as Indians, and others they're colored persons, and also as mulatto, and sometimes there's no descriptor at all, which might indicate that they are white, or just that nobody wrote down an indicator in that sense. So you can see how it can get tricky. If you're focused on thinking that you need to just look at one descriptor, you really need to broaden out, and the family can be identified in a variety of different ways. So deeds and probate typically have really great information that can help you connect family members. And this is true of all genealogy. But here on the example I'm going to show you right now, I located in our online database of Plymouth County probate files. And this record kind of caught my eye just because in the index he was identified as being Indian. So I, of course, had to look at the original deed, or the will, rather. So this is Samuel Sonnet, and he is identified in his probate as being Indian. And this gives a great description of his land. And this is exciting because when you have a description of the land, you can really place the person and figure out exactly where they're coming from. And particularly if you're trying to figure out what native nation this person is from, this information can be very useful. So if you're using this in conjunction with that place name book that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you can get a really good idea of what native groups were living in that area and the likelihood that your ancestor is coming from that particular group. And then his will goes on to mention all of his children by name and then how much of the land they each received. So this is where, using probates and land records like this, this is really actually a deed in a will that lays out the land specifically. This can help you moving forward in a family or finding other family members or other related surnames to continue your search. So if you find records for these folks, some of the earlier vital records that I showed you were for some of these individuals, and they're not always identified as Indian, but coming back to this record, you can see that there are Native ancestry in the family. So census records are also important. I just wanted to give a brief overview of the different type of census records that you might find your ancestors mentioned in. So, of course, you have your regular U.S. federal census. So in these examples, I'm just going to take you through, and we're following the same individuals through each of these census records. So this is the nephew family of Chattaraugus Reservation. So you can see at the top of the page that they're actually recording that it's on an Indian reservation. So this gives you the exact location of where they're coming from, and then the standard information that you would see in the U.S. federal census. This individual is also then in the New York State Census. So we're talking about a New York State reservation, so they do come up in the New York State Census as well. Again, they're just listing the location, and this is specific for Indians on a reservation, this part of the New York State Census. So that tells you right there that these individuals are living on a reservation. And then we also have the Indian Census. So an act of Congress on July 4th of 1884 required that the Bureau of Indian Affairs begin to record an annual census on most Indian reservations in the United States. So beginning in 1885, you have these types of records, and these vary by tribe. Not all of them have them. Some of them only have them certain years. They add on some, as time goes on. So you may or may not be able to find your particular individuals, but there are a lot of these Indian census records for New York in particular, and then other places around New England. So these are a great resource to check out. They are available on Ancestry to search, and then you can get them for free through Internet Archive, but there's no index or search option there. So you'd have to kind of look by place and by date and go through the rules, browse it that way, but that option would be free. And then to point out, the 1910 U.S. federal census actually had a separate Indian population census, and this recorded different information than the other census records. And we actually have a zoom in on the next slide here of this bottom section here, and this gives the title of the tribe of the person, of the father, and of the mother. And you can see an example on line 15 there that the person is Tuscaroran because their mother is Tuscaroran. So this is an example of a tribal group that follows matrilineal descent. So that individual is Tuscaroran because their mother is. And that's something that you'll want to be aware of particularly if you're applying for tribal membership. Groups like the Seneca still follow matrilineal descent, so you'll want to know that ahead of time so you can trace your family through the maternal line as opposed to the paternal line, which is what we're typically do in other genealogy work. So I also wanted to highlight some of our great manuscript collections that we have here at NEHGS that can help you in your search for American Indian ancestors here in New England. One of the best collections we have for this is the Rudy Otteri papers, and this is where searching manuscript collections, you have to kind of be creative in your searching methods sometimes, because sometimes it's not obvious that a manuscript would have information that you're looking for. But this collection, it's rather large. It consists of about 60 boxes, and it's on the Brotherton Indian tribe. And this woman, Rudy Otteri, became very interested in her husband's ancestry, and this is a collection of all of her papers. So just a little history on the Brotherton Indians. So they were founded by a Mohican named Samson Occam, and this is him here in the photo here. And he's a descendant of the Pequots following the Pequot War. The tribe is now located in Wisconsin, but they started as a group of so-called praying Indians that descend from Christianized Algonquin-speaking tribes of southern New England and Long Island. And right around the 1870s or so, they received land or came into an agreement of a land agreement with the Oneida Nation in Oneida County, New York. So there's a lot in the collection that involves that land purchase and that land agreement, and letters and deeds and treaties back and forth between all of these nations. And then in the 1830s, the Brothertons, along with a number of Oneida, also under pressure of the U.S. federal government, were moved to Wisconsin in the 1830s. So this kind of gives you, as I was saying when we were looking at the map, of how different regions are also connected to the Northeast, particularly when removal is involved and you have groups kind of constantly being pushed west. That they're all kind of interconnected. But the great thing about this collection, if you're looking for any of your ancestors in New England or New York, is that it kind of follows the path of the Brotherton Indians. So each of the locations where they kind of settled, there's information in this collection from those groups. So this is an example of one of the big family charts that's a part of this collection. And you can see kind of Rudy Otteri's scribblings and note-taking that she did of each of the families and the individuals and how they connect. There's also notes on the backs of these. But before we even get into this, the first whole section of the collection has copies of rolls, lists, and account records for the Brotherton tribe and other tribes in New England and New York. So since they kind of had this movement westward and they came into contact with a number of these groups, Rudy Otteri's research also includes a lot on New England tribes and New York tribes. So even if you're not a descendant of the Brothertons or think that you have any connection there, this collection is worth looking at, because you might be able to find some of your folks at least mentioned in these records. In fact, when I was kind of going through the collection, there were a number of surnames that I kept seeing that I recognized from my work up at Akwesasne, that you kind of see how the families are all connected. And the really interesting thing about these charts is that they're huge. They take up a whole table, and you can kind of see her thought process. The collection also includes the petitions for recognition and the application for recognition of Brotherton tribal members. And those are really neat as well, because while Rudy Otteri's work takes it from the earliest known ancestor and kind of works forward, the applications start with the applicant and work backwards. So using the collection as a whole, you can kind of work in both directions and see how everybody connects. And then there's also copies. This is another section of her page, so you can see it kind of goes on, and then she scribbles off notes and has other notes. So these can really give you clues as to where to look for more information, or even other related families, even if she couldn't quite figure out how everybody connected. The collection then goes on to have a number of copies of historical deeds and treaties and letters for groups in New England and New York, particularly the Narragansett and the Oneida, and there's a number of letters between the St. Regis Mohawk tribe and the Brotherton Indians about land. There's correspondence between the Oneida and the Brothertons about land. So in each of these documents you have individuals that are signing off or are mentioned. You can then even get specific locations where they're talking about land rights and that sort of thing. So there's great information here, even if you're not looking for a Brotherton ancestor. Some other manuscript collections that may seem like they might not have anything to do with American Indians, but do. This one, the Lemuel Shattuck collection, you can see here in the description, even on our website, there's no indication that there's anything to do with American Indians at all. And this is where sometimes asking the folks at an archive or that know what manuscripts they hold in the collection. You can see in the finding aid section on this, it says there's a draft inventory in the library. So somebody in the library knows what's in the collection. It just hasn't been completed yet. So we were told that there was something of note in this collection. And that is first, there is the Lord's Prayer in the Indian language as it's titled here. So this is kind of just a neat piece to see where they're writing out the Lord's Prayer in the native language here. And then also included here were the names and ages of Indians on Martha's Vineyard. So this is taken about 1823. And the thing that I found interesting in noting here was you can see the Cooper name here over and over and over again. The Brotherton Indian collection that I talked about earlier, the Rudy Otteri papers, have a number of Coopers here, some of which seem to repeat. So like I said, that collection is something that you might want to look at even if you're not related to the Brotherton tribe. But this is how you can find in manuscript collections lists like this that seemingly you wouldn't necessarily think would be in that collection. And here too we have a list of the soldiers, both English and Indian, that detached within the county of Barnstable. So this too, if you were to do even just a search in the catalog search, it only comes up as the only reference to American Indians in it is that it's Indians of North America Wars in Massachusetts. So there's really no indication that there would be some great genealogical information in here. But the record has this list, and you can see here that they're listing Indians underneath. First, they have the white folks from each of these locations, and then are also listing the Indians underneath that. And what I think is really interesting about this and could be helpful in furthering your search is that they're not only giving you the native person's name, but also saying that they're servant to, and then giving you the English person's name that they're working for, so that you can also know to research that person. So it can be easier to locate records for white individuals in this time period. So noting these names might aid in your search. Researching into them, you can locate family papers or other account records or other little obscure pieces of information that might list more about your ancestors and help you work forward or backwards. And again, here's another, just a little piece, Indian account book. So here we have the debts and credits concerning the sale of estates. So this was Joseph Twitchell on behalf of the Natick Indians. And you can see here at the top of the list it says that he is the guardian in possession of the following estates. And then it lists out the Natick Indians by name, whose estate he's now in possession of. And then on the continuing of the page, it lists out the amount that they're using in support of particular individuals. So again, account records, things like this, particularly if you can identify somebody who was an Indian agent, you'll definitely want to look at their papers for the particular group that you're looking at. This is the type of information that typically end up in their collection of papers that could list out more information on the tribe itself. Another collection that gets used frequently here is this company for the propagation of the gospel in New England. And these can have meeting minutes. They also have a list of those living in Freetown, Martha's Vineyard, Mashpee, Natick, and Stockbridge. So this gets used quite frequently enough that it is currently off-site and unavailable because it is being digitized so that it can go onto our website. So this will be something that would be easily accessible for you in the near future. Some other manuscripts that I just kind of want to mention is first this petition of the Indians, inhabitants of the town of Natick. So this is an unsigned petition requesting the sale of 100 acres at Natick. There's also more account books, Samuel Sewell. This is missionary payments paid out for the, quote, Indian stock, primarily missionary and teacher salaries and other expenses. It also includes a copy of the 1904 commission for Sewell and others authorizing them to be commissioners for Indian work that year. So these are the types of things that might include other information about Native individuals. We also have the documents relating to Neshoba Plantation, and then also the Dean family papers and genealogical records. This, if you look closely at the description, it says that Thomas Dean was at Brotherton in Clinton, Oneida County, New York, and these include letters, they're personal letters, but they're also addressed to him as his role as Indian agent. So the ones that are addressed to him as an Indian agent are typically concerned with treaties, land claims of the Oneida and the Brotherton Indians, and the defense of Indian rights. So this is another example of how personal papers for an Indian agent can include information about the tribe itself. And then we also have a collection of the ancestors of Tabitha Wayman's Indian mother. This is a typescript genealogy that includes the Algonquin and Indian ancestry of Tabitha Wyman, and who was born circa 1765 in New Hampshire. It also has information that explores the history of Indian tribes in the 17th and 18th century in northern New England. So if you've got folks in northern New England, that might be something that you'll want to take a peek at. So in addition to manuscripts, you likely will want to broaden out your search to ethnographies, reports, scholarly works, histories, that sort of thing. All of them can contain information and clues about your ancestors. Here in Massachusetts, an important report for doing American Indian genealogy is the Earl Report. So specifically, Earl was named commissioner to examine the condition of all Indians and their descendants in the Commonwealth. And this was done it was published in 1861. So the task at hand for him was to record the number of people in their place and their social and political condition and the economic state of each of the individuals. The actual documentation submitted by Earl in 1861 has 3 different sections, 132 pages of the report. There's also his proposed act to enfranchise the Bay State Indians, and an appendix, which is the most widely used by genealogists, American Indian genealogists, is a 78-page listing of Native families. So this is his so-called census, and this is an example of that here on the slide. We do have a genealogist here on site, David Lambert, who's working on a project to get this up on our website. so that you can easily search for individuals. It's going to be going up tribe by tribe, is my understanding. So you'll want to look for that in the coming months. Scholarly works are always a really great idea to look at, even if just for looking at the sources that they used. These are a couple of works by well-known historians. They're well-respected. Lawrence Hopman typically gets really involved in the community, and his books contain genealogical information as well as his historical information that he's trying to make a point of. So his works are really important if you're doing any work on the Haudenosaunee or the Six Nations. You'll definitely want to take a look at that. Same thing with Colin Calloway's work. These give you a good idea even just of the history in general of an area so that you can have an idea of where to look for resources. Footnotes in these books are very important when you're doing your own research, that you can have direction as to where to look for more information. Sometimes they're able to find something that you never would have thought to look for. So. Same thing about town histories. So town histories typically include a section about the native inhabitants before they get into European arrival or settlement. And they sometimes mention individuals by name and then give specific families, or at least get you to a point in the more recent past where you might be able to find some of those folks in vital records as well. And it also just gives you, helps you understand the history of a region. Half the battle with doing Native ancestry is really understanding the history. You're having to do a lot of history work alongside genealogical work because you're not going to always find people listed in the standard genealogical resources that we think of. So really getting to know the history of a region, how people were moving, what the migrations were, when removal happened. This is why all the deeds and all of those are very important. Can give you an idea of exactly where people are, how the tribes are developing over time, what their relationships are with other nations, and can also give you an idea about intermarriages and that sort of thing that might lead you to more information. So you're really going to want to do a lot of historical research right alongside your genealogical research. And also don't discredit the use of documents and objects in museums. So museum objects in particular, I think we tend to overlook as sources of information, particularly genealogical information. But most objects in a museum have a provenance of where it came from, who made it, who donated it, how it got there. And if you pair this up, particularly with ethnographies or works by anthropologists, I know that the New York State Museum, which is where I've done a lot of my work, their ethnography collections will give detailed description of each object's, how the information anthropologists discovered about said object while they were on the reservation or while they were collecting it. Sometimes there's history, the history of the object itself gives you the family lineage. So if you can get into, if you discover that there's an object in a collection that was made by somebody who has the same surname as somebody in your family or something like that, really getting into the provenance of that object, requesting that information from the museum can help you with your genealogical search. And also the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center has got a developing library that they're expanding their information about tribes across the country. So that's a good resource as well. And then there's just a couple of books and things that I thought I would mention that we have here in our library that could be helpful to your search. I kind of separated these out by location. We have a collection of researching Native Americans in New York State, and these actually include transcripts of census records, other vital records, and they're kind of all compiled into a series that have different sections in them. So if you're looking for anybody in New York State, that's a good resource to go to. there's a couple of different authors, so you can see Indians from New York. There's 3 volumes there. That these kind of all work together and are helpful in pointing you in direction in New York State. And then the Wampanoag Genealogical History of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. This does have good genealogical information. If you're looking for ancestors in this area, they do follow through with family lines, just like you would see in any other typical genealogy publication. Again, in New England, the St. Francis Abenaki Paper Trail. These are primarily notarial records from 1790 to 1900, but they do include a good amount of vital records or information about land and that sort of thing. So this is a really great resource if you're looking for Abenaki, particularly up in Canada. And then A Man Called Samson. This is written by the woman who developed whose collection we have, the Rudy Otteri papers. So this is kind of a nice and neat way that all of the information on the Brotherton Indians were put together. It has got a nice index in the back by name, so you can go directly to the family. It's a good starting off point to see if there's information in the collection that might be useful for you. But I will say that not all of the information in the collection made it into that book, so it really is just a starting point to doing research there. Maliseet Micmac Vital Records from New Brunswick. These are church records. They're transcribed and pretty easy to use. This is a book here in our library and is very helpful if you're looking for individuals in New Brunswick. And then also Indians from New York and Ontario and Quebec. So these are specifically focused on those that went from New York to Ontario and Quebec or back again. So particularly if you're looking at tribes such as the Akwesasne that are on the border, this is something that you probably would want to check out. And then I just had kind of a little brief case study for you just to kind of show you how I worked backwards in this Edward and Lewis family of Mashpee. So your first step always is to start with you or your parents or grandparents or however far back you know. So we started here with we've got Annie Edwards here listed on the 1940 federal census. And you can see here on even the federal census here in 1940, she is listed as being Indian. So that's kind of our starting point here, Annie and Clarence. So then we wanted to search for vital records for those individuals. And we used our databases here at NEHGS to do this. So we have all these vital records available through our online database. So you can see here we found the marriage record for Clarence Edwards and Annie F. Lewis, and this gives us their parents' names. I will want to point out to you that this marriage record does not include any information that would indicate that these folks are Indian. So you will find this as well, where you find records where there's no indication that that is the case. But as you'll see as we work backward, there are records that do say that. So here we have Clarence Edwards' birth record, and in his birth record he is identified as being Indian. It does have his parents here, so we can compare that to the marriage record and know that we have the same parents. And this does give us his specific location, that he's born in Mashpee. It gives you a little bit more information that his father was from West Sandwich and his mother was from Mashpee. So this will help you in working backwards. So this is kind of typical genealogical motion here that we've got going. So we couldn't find a birth record for Annie, but I was able to find her on the 1900 U.S. federal census, listed here with her parents. Again, the parents' names match those on her marriage record, and she is identified here in this record as being Indian. And then we're going to search for the next generation as kind of your next step back. And So we found James A. Lewis here and Angelina Pompey's. Notice that they are both listed as colored. As opposed to Indian here. So this is another example of how records can change over time. You can have the same person over time being described in different ways, and some of this might just be the perception of the person writing down the record, and if they thought they were a particular race or not. So don't be surprised when you see your ancestors being recorded this way. But again, this gives you the parents' names on the marriage record, so we're able to continue to go backwards in time. And here we have marriage record for those parents. You can see that they're again listed as Indian here. We also have the names of their parents, so you can continue to kind of work backwards in this fashion. And I just wanted to note here on James A. Lewis's death record, here he's listed as mulatto. So again, you will see a variety of different ways that these folks are recorded. We do know this is the same James A. Lewis. Our informant here is Angelina F. Lewis, so we're in the same family here. And then you want to take all this information and check it against any reports or approved rolls that you have, so as far back as you can go. In this particular case, we would be checking the Earl Report, which I mentioned earlier. So typically, if you have an ancestor recorded here, then you qualify for membership in the tribe. So you can see here we've got James A. Lewis listed right here. He's 17 years old. And also Spencer Edwards. So we have a number of the family members here listed on the report. We also have another page that shows you that we've got more ancestors that are also listed on the report. So there, Matthias, Amos, and Angelina is right there. So this would then be the proof that you would need once you've found those ancestors, you've documented them through vital records, you've been able to prove that they're the same people that show up on the approved roll. This would be the type of information that you would then submit for tribal membership. And I just wanted to wrap up by saying that this is just kind of an overview of the sources that we have here at NEHGS that are focused primarily on the Northeast, but we're not limited to that, even though New England is in our name. We do have resources for tribes all over the country. We do have publications and books for groups in Kansas and the Dawes rolls and some of the Cherokee rolls. So we do have more information. There's just way too much to be able to cover in one webinar. So we decided to kind of limit it down just to New England. But stay tuned in the future. We probably will end up focusing some of our later programming on other regions of the country. But don't be discouraged if your folks aren't in New England. We do have resources for you.
All right, thank you, Meaghan, for your presentation. So now let's tackle your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, please go ahead and type it in the questions panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. So Meaghan, Barbara asks, basically, how do you find out if there's an Indian census for a certain group? So she's specifically asking for she's interested in the Narragansetts of Charlestown, Rhode Island, or the Eastern Pequots of Stonington, Connecticut. But how do you know if there's an Indian census that exists for that group?
The first thing I would do for any particular group is to contact the tribe itself to find out if there's a roll or a list that is kind of their accepted model of proof, then they would know if it exists. So they're kind of your first resource to go to finding out what kind of documentation of that level exists for the tribe that you're trying to find information on. Even if you're not interested in actually receiving tribal membership, I wouldn't hesitate to contact them just to see what kind of information there is available. They're going to be your best resource for knowing what kind of genealogical resources there are available, because they're the ones checking it against whatever their qualifications are for membership. So that would be my recommendation, would be to contact the tribe directly to find out what roles they accept or that they know exist. In some cases, you might end up finding, we do have lists such as the ones that show up in our manuscripts collections that some folks might not even really know exist, that got shuffled in with, an Indian agent's papers over time. And that's where doing the research on any of the Indian agents for a tribe is also beneficial, because sometimes people don't even know they exist. So you could be the first one to find something, but that could be useful for your case. But in most cases, if it's something that's going to be an accepted documentation, or something that is even used in some capacity by the tribe, they're going to know about it.
All right. Now, Alan asks if you know of any compilations of kind of common English names that Native Americans in New England adopted.
I'm not sure about that, to be honest, but that place names book that I mentioned at the beginning that we have here in our store, that, like I said, they do have in the back a list of Indian names, and that too you can then, I believe they do give you, in instances where people are using two different names, an English name and an Indian name, both are listed there. So that might be a good source to start with. I mean, there's another whole area that you could go into with how names were adopted and surnames were adopted and all of that. I do know that there are kind of online groups that have put together lists of, say, common surnames amongst the Iroquois, for example. There's a website that has kind of put together how frequently a surname is used within a particular nation. So if you have, that can be useful if you're looking for an ancestor that you know the surname and you know it's probably this line or somebody connected to that line. You can kind of see if that's a surname that even exists within the tribe. And if so, who are the descendants that are still living on the reservation today that have that name. You might want to try to get in contact with those folks to see if you can find more information about their ancestors that could lead you to more information on yours. But as far as like a nice, neat little compilated book, I don't know of any. That would be really great to have. But I think, kind of piecing together those different resources might help with answer your question.
And kind of related, Michael asks, he says, in Quebec records, I see Iroquois parents and children listed with different Iroquois surnames. How did they determine surnames?
Well, surnames are a tricky thing. And like I said, a lot of it would have to do with historic context. You might end up having folks listed within the household of individuals that are coming from marriages or relationships where they're not married. Sometimes you have family groups that are adopting a surname for a particular reason and then it's passed on in a different way. Within the Iroquois, you might have that situation if it's a matrilineal descent, where you're having the children be named after the mother instead of the father. So you might want to kind of look back at the records and see if that could be the case. But surnames are tricky. It's similar in other groups where surnames weren't something that were traditionally used within the community, that they become something that can sometimes lead your research askew because not all of it makes sense all of the time. Sometimes it's just a matter of what somebody decided they were going to call themselves, and then either that stuck and got passed down, or there was some sort of relationship with a European that then the surname got passed down. So there's not an easy way to answer that question because it could just be based by the case itself. But you might want to kind of look at it and try to map the surnames just to see if there's any way that maybe the descent is happening through like a matrilineal kind of thing, or if there's related families that maybe they're adopted children of that family. But yeah, surnames can be a tricky one to kind of wrap your mind around with researching because it's not cut and dry. So there's really no one answer to answer that question.
Now, I know a lot of you are asking about what resources we have for specific groups and specific tribes. You know, Richard's asking about the Nipmuc, Gail's asking about the Onondaga. Instead of kind of going through what do we have for each individual tribe, how would you suggest people look through our resources to see what we have?
So the plan is, in the future, we're going to be putting together a study guide that will be available on our website that will then list out by the different tribal nations what resources we have for each group. In the meantime, what I would suggest is to go into our catalog and do a subject search and put in whatever group you're looking for, plus the name, plus Indian after it, and then going into, once you find a record, go to the bottom, you'll see different ways that we might have cataloged it into our collections, and it can lead you to other resources that might have something to do with the particular group you're looking for. So that's the best way that I can say for you to search, is to really go into the catalog in a subject search and put in the name of the tribe you're looking for and seeing what different categories we have on resources for that particular tribe. But in the near future, hopefully, we will have the study guide up on our website that will be able to directly list each of the resources we have for the different groups.
Thanks. I just kind of add to that too that you know, looking at what you have in your area and what other archives and other repositories hold is really important. And there are two great resources, two websites that I would just recommend. Of course, WorldCat, so you can see, you know, what books are held. You can actually put in a title of a book, you can put in your zip code, and it will tell you kind of where that book is most closely located to you. Of course, call that library or repository ahead of time to make sure that it's on their stacks. But so, you know, if you can't make it into Boston, but you are interested in one of the titles that we've mentioned, certainly go to WorldCat and see if there's one closer to you. Another website is Archive Grid, which again kind of takes catalogs, online catalogs from lots of different archives and repositories, puts them on one site, and so our resources are there, a number of other repositories across the country. So I just recommend taking a look at those two websites, and you might be surprised as to what you find. Maybe just one more question before we wrap up for today. No, Dorothy asks, what about individuals who were adopted? How are they properly tracked, you know, as far as ancestry goes?
I will say that, just to start answering your question, that I am not an adoption expert, so I'm going to just go by my experience. But it could be the case, like the previous question, where you've got a bunch of different surnames within a household. That might be one clue to tracing the person further back as far as biology goes. DNA can be a great way to kind of crack the questions involved in adoption. I know we do a lot of cases here in research services where that's the case, where we suggest folks have their DNA done so that they can connect with cousins. Distant cousins can end up giving you more information about the family more broadly, so that you can try to locate those ancestors. In my experience, it's not always documented that somebody is adopted. If you're going to be looking at census records, it's hit or miss. Sometimes they do say that it's an adopted daughter, sometimes they don't. So it can be hard to kind of figure out, but you As far as during that person's lifetime, you're typically going to want to be looking at the adopted parents themselves. Breaking the wall, going further back, you're probably going to want to talk to somebody who's specializes in adoption genealogy, which is not something that I feel strong enough to be able to fully answer that question.
All right. Well, I know that there were a number of questions that unfortunately we didn't get to. Like I said, a lot of them did pertain to, kind of what resources we have for specific tribes or specific areas too. Certainly, Canada and the Midwest and the South and really across the country. I do highly recommend going to our online library catalog, and that's just library.americanancestors.org. You can do a subject search for either the group or the nation, as well as searching for local histories on a variety of areas. So do take a look. But if you do have, if you'd like more hands-on help with your project or have more detailed questions about the specifics of your research, you may also want to consider scheduling a consultation or hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about these services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide. And I'll also include that information in my follow-up email to you tomorrow. But thank you again for joining us today. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.